So there has been a lot of changes and new things that have happened in the last month and a half, including interest rates rising and new legislation or talk of new legislation, which is not fully in action from the federal government. And I think there's a lot of worry and speculation in the market. This session hopefully will set us on ease. We had an earlier session with our mortgage partners last week. That recording I will send along with this recording for you guys to just gauge on as to what's happening, and hopefully it will give you a good footing for to advise your clients adequately. So, David Corman.
Well, thanks very much, Sabiha. And before we started recording, Sabiha did a little introduction of me and my firm that wasn't unfortunately recorded, but it took me a couple minutes, I think, to recover from that. I have a lump in my throat, still have a little bit too, of those nice, kind words of the history of our firm and your brokerage that goes way back 30 odd years. And it was a special relationship. So I get choked up every time we talk about it. I know David Gorski and I talk about it all the time on our podcasts. I assume each and every one of you is religiously tuning into our podcast, David and David on Real Estate, every week. If not, you should be. It's available to YouTube. You can find it anywhere, and look at table of contents, pick and choose what you want. There's some really good information on there, and it's a lot of fun for me to do that with David every week. So as Sabiha said, there's been some changes, and you got to keep in mind, what governments are doing sometimes they propose these changes. I think everybody is probably aware that there's an election coming up provincially pretty soon. You're probably bombarded with phone calls and emails like I am from candidates and from the leaders of the parties. And I think some of that was driving this amendment to the non-resident speculation tax and also to the federal government's recent budget. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes as well, what they're proposing to do. And a lot of it is pure politics, but the politicians feel some pressure. We're in a pretty crazy real estate market that's been like this for a while, with multi-offer bidding, and you guys are out there slugging it out. Every offer, it seems, has more than one, and you're competing, and you gotta lose a bunch sometimes till you win. It's really tough on you real estate agents with your clients, and I feel for you. So this is one attempt, I think, by the government to try and curb some of that. Whether or not successful or not, we'll wait and see. But let's get into the presentation that I've got for you here. And this is just to show you what I used to look like before COVID, when I was doing in-person seminars, and I look forward to getting back to doing that with you. I did wear a jacket today, even though I'm in my home studio, just to try and look the part. But hopefully we'll get back.
Very sharp.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope we'll get back to doing these in person, but this is a great way to reach a wider audience and do it at your convenience. So there's advantages doing these webinars, but I miss the seminars and the in-person opportunities with everybody. And I think you're pretty familiar with my firm and what we do. We're mostly a real estate boutique, do some corporate commercial, we do wills and estates for our clients. And we have a lawyer that joined us last summer that does some family work as well. So we've added that to our areas of practice, and where our offices are. And I also, in addition to our 3 full offices, I consider every Tim Hortons and Starbucks in the city one of our offices as well. So please follow us anywhere social media. We have a YouTube channel now, a TikTok. We're all over the place. You should be able to find us, and including, as I mentioned, make sure you can find anywhere you can get a podcast, or even on our YouTube channel, you'll find the David and David on Real Estate podcast. So there's enough for my commercial. Let's get into what is the Nrst. And just keep in mind, what I'm doing here is I'm first reviewing with you what the original legislation is. What is the Non-Resident Speculation Tax Act? So you can understand what that is. And then by knowing what that is, then you'll see what the recent amendments are to it. Because the old act, or the original act, still applies. Okay, so the amendments didn't do away with the old act. It just depends when an agreement of purchase sale was signed, whether the original legislation applies or whether the new amendments that were announced a couple weeks ago apply. So the original legislation, the Nrst is a 15% tax on the purchase of an interest in residential property in a new territory that the government created. There is no such thing as the Greater Golden Horseshoe until the Nrst was passed. And they just said this legislation is not going to be applicable to the whole province of Ontario. It's only going to be this one area, which we're defining as the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And it's a tax against people that are non-citizens or permanent residents of Canada, or if they're foreign corporations. So we call these foreign entities, and we include taxable trustees, because when they passed this legislation, they were trying to figure out how are all these smart people going to try and get around this legislation. You know, what are the schemes they're going to try and come up with? So they really tried to close all the loopholes. So you'll see why they include foreign corporations and taxable trustees in this. Okay, now the Nrst has nothing to do with land transfer tax. The land transfer tax rules were not changed by this. They remain as they are. Land transfer tax payable on every transaction in Ontario. If it's a transaction in the city of Toronto, there's an additional land transfer tax. That is paid regardless of whether Nrst is paid or not. Nrst, if it is payable, it's in addition to the regular land transfer tax. So they defined the Greater Golden Horseshoe as being a bunch of these cities. So I'll show you a map here so you'll see geographically what the Greater Golden Horseshoe looks like. So just for example, on the north end of it, we've got the city of Orillia. So if you had a client that was buying a property in Muskoka, for example, that was north of the city of Orillia, a cottage or another residential property, there wouldn't be Nrst payable. Same thing if you were east of Peterborough or west of Waterloo. Same thing. If you're outside those areas, it wouldn't be payable under the old law, because it's only for a property in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So, and I'm not going to go through read this, but the slide presentation will be available to you anyway. So these are just some of the areas that are included in there. So the effective date of this legislation was April 21, 2017. It's amazing how time flies when you're having fun. So it's 5 years already that this legislation has been in effect. So this is applicable and binding on any agreement of purchase and sale that's signed on that date or after. If an agreement was signed prior to April 21, 2017, the Nrst wouldn't be applicable. Now, even though we're 5 years later, there still are some transactions out there where the Nrst is not applicable, because these were typically builder deals, obviously, condo or other residential construction, were on projects that got delayed and still haven't been completed, and there are some of those out there. So we're still closing transactions where the Nrst is not applicable, because the agreements of purchase and sale were signed on April 20th, 2017 or prior to that. So there would no be Nrst payable if it predated this legislation. And think back, if you can, for those of you that have been around, if you remember what was going on in the market back in April 2017, it wasn't that much different than what we're currently experiencing. At the time, there was a low supply on the market. There were multi-offer bids on almost every property, and it was driving the prices high. So people were, a lot of screaming and yelling, complaining, especially people in the Greater Golden Horseshoe that wanted to live here. They were finding it really hard to find a property or an affordable property. So the government at the time, in their infinite wisdom, said, let's pass this Nrst, let's tax 15% on people that are foreigners or foreign entities. And that should help solve the problem of these increasing purchase prices. What they failed to even look at or do at the time is study and determine exactly what percentage is being driven by these foreign entities. And it turns out there were studies done after they passed the legislation, and it turns out it was only 4 to 6% of the market in the Greater Golden Horseshoe was actually where there was purchasers that were foreign entities that would be subject to the Nrst. So even if you took those people completely out of the market, you still got to deal with the other 95% that were in the market, and it had nothing to do with the foreign entities being involved. It was supply and demand. There just wasn't enough on the market at the time. And these things are always cyclical. For those of you that have been around real estate for a while, you'll know that, there's always these cycles that we go through. So this is what the government passed anyways. And the reality is the net effect, there was, and I do a lot of work with foreign buyers, and most foreign buyers that we deal with, I don't have an exact percentage, but I will say most, still decided they were going to buy property in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. They said, okay, it's way better than investing in the country we're currently living in, whether it was a European country or China or somewhere else. And they said, we still want to invest in Canada. It's a better place for our money. So we're not going to make as much of a profit over time as we thought we might. It's going to cost us an extra 15% up front, but it's still worth doing it. A lot of them still bought. Some of them just chose to buy out of the Greater Golden Horseshoe and bought in some of the surrounding areas. And but whether they did buy or they didn't buy it, it didn't have any effect really, or a marginal effect on the market and prices going up. But the government, once they realized that, they said, oh, but in the meantime, we're getting 15% of the action here. So let's just keep it going, because if we're doing nothing, we get 15% of the purchase price on all these transactions. So why? That's a great revenue source. So let's just keep it going. So anyways, I try not to make too much political commentary when I do these things, but somehow I can't help myself. But you have to keep in mind that there's always politics involved in these type of decisions. So who does the Nrst apply to? And that hasn't changed. It applies to what's considered a foreign entity or a taxable trustee. So back in 2017, these are the slides we used. The Leafs were in the playoffs with the Washington Capitals at the time. So Alex Ovechkin, a Russian national, was an easy target. The guy in the middle with the nice hair, I think everybody knows. So if he decided to buy a residential property in Toronto or the Greater Golden Horseshoe, whether it's a condo or a palace, he'd be subject to the Nrst, as would Jose Bautista at the time, because he was a citizen of the Dominican. And even though he was a hero for the Toronto Blue Jays, it would apply to him as well. So a foreign entity is either a foreign national or a foreign corporation. So when I'm using that term, foreign entity, it's a foreign national or a foreign corporation. So foreign national is any individual that's not a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident of Canada. So those are the criteria, because if you are a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident of Canada, this isn't applicable to you. If you are one of those, you're considered a foreign national, you have to pay the Nrst. And they wanted to get foreign corporations in there as well, because they're already trying to shut down potential.
David, can I
loopholes.
cut in for a second?
Sure.
So you said permanent resident, which is a PR card holder, right? Or a Canadian
citizen
corporation or a Canadian citizen. What about students on student visa or people on work visa that are living here as expats?
The Nrst applies to them because they are not permanent residents. They are not Canadian citizens. Okay, so it's applicable against them. There are rebates available, and I'll get to that in a couple minutes, that apply to people in those situations. Okay, but it is payable, and it's a question of whether or not they will qualify for a rebate to get it afterwards. Okay.
Right.
So if you're a foreign corporation, again, this is them trying to close loopholes before they even happen. So foreign corporation is a corporation that's not incorporated in Canada, which is pretty obvious, or a corporation that is incorporated in Canada, but it's controlled in whole or in part by someone who is a foreign national or another foreign corporation. And this doesn't apply to shares on a Canadian stock exchange. So these are private corporations. So if anybody is involved with that corporation, even though it's incorporated in Canada, anybody that is controlling, even by part, okay, having a 1% interest, and they are a foreign national, or if it's owned by a foreign corporation, that taints it, and they would be considered a foreign corporation for the purpose of the Nrst, and it'll apply. So that was right away trying to close a loophole, say, well, if I'm not a Canadian citizen, so how about if I get my cousin who's a Canadian citizen to incorporate a company, and we'll do it through the company, and I'll just be a shareholder or a director of the company, and I can control the company that way because it's really my asset. Well, the answer is no, that won't work. The Nrst is still going to be payable. okay, because it's controlled by someone that's considered a foreign entity. So the other loophole they want to address right away is a taxable trustee. So a taxable trustee is a foreign entity. Again, it's a foreign entity that's holding a property in trust for beneficiaries. Okay, so a Canadian citizen, permanent resident, or a corporation holding in trust for a foreign entity, okay, is considered a taxable trustee. So again, that's trying to close a loophole. Okay, I know I would have to pay the Nrst because I'm not a Canadian citizen, but what if I get my cousin who is a Canadian citizen to buy the property in trust for me? Therefore, he'll buy it, he'll close the deal, no Nrst payable. Well, the answer, no, Nrst is payable because that cousin is not the beneficial owner of the property. He's holding the property in trust. He's a taxable trustee. He's holding it in trust for somebody who is a foreign entity. So that doesn't work either. Okay. Now, not all properties are subject to the Nrst. It's residential properties only. So someone, a foreign entity, is buying a commercial property, there's no Nrst payable. Okay. It has to be a residential property, and it has to be not more than 6 single-family residences. So if it's more than 6 family residents, like an apartment building, more than 6 units, Nrst is not payable because it's considered a commercial property pretty much for the purposes of this. So it's anything 6 and under Nrst would be payable. Now, some properties are mixed residential and commercial. So if someone is acquiring a property that's mixed residential and commercial, then we have to figure out the proportions. So in the example here, if the purchase price was $1 million on this mixed property, and the property had a single family residence that had a value of $400,000 and the commercial unit was a value of $600,000, the Nrst would only be payable to the residential portion. So it'll be 15% of $400,000 in that example. Okay, now, really important for you to understand that if the Nrst is payable on a transaction, because somebody involved in the transaction is a foreign entity, then the Nrst becomes payable on the whole purchase price, the whole value of consideration. Okay, so here's an example of a residential property is being purchased by 4 people. One is a foreign entity requiring a 25% interest, and the other 3 are not. The other 3 are Canadian citizens, let's say, each requiring a 25% interest. So only one of the 4 is a foreign entity. The Nrst is still payable on 100% of the purchase price, not just on 25% of the foreign entity's interest in the property. So that because there's a foreign entity involved in the purchase, he taints it for everybody else. Same rules apply if he had a 1% or a 0.1% interest. If the Nrst is applicable to anybody that's acquiring the property, it becomes applicable, it becomes payable on 100% of the purchase price. Okay, now I mentioned before, when the question from Sabiha was about workers and students, and that we're going to talk about in a minute. That is a rebate. Okay, and we're going to talk about rebates in a minute. But aside from rebates, the legislation included exemptions. Okay, so the difference between an exemption and a rebate is if there's an exemption, if you qualify for one of these 3 exemptions, you do not have to pay the Nrst at all. If you're trying to apply for a rebate, means you have to, at the time the transaction is closed, the property is subject to the Nrst, it's payable, you have to pay the 15%, but you might qualify after closing for one of the available rebates. If you qualify for one of the rebates, you apply for the rebate, you get the Nrst back. So that's the difference. So there's these 3 exemptions that are available where the Nrsts would otherwise be payable, but if you qualify under one of these exemptions, then you don't have to pay the Nrst. So it's if you're an immigrant nominee, a convention refugee, or the spouse is a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, or a nominee, or falls under one of the other categories of nominee or refugee. Okay, so if you qualify for an exemption, it wouldn't be payable. But if someone qualified for an exemption, but there's another party to the transaction that is a foreign entity, then the NRST would still be payable. Because remember what I said, if anybody taints it, if anybody involved in the transaction is a foreign entity, then it will be payable on 100% of the purchase price, regardless of whether other parties would be exempt from paying NRST. So just to dig down a little bit more, the first exemption is the nominee exemption. So to qualify for this, the foreign national has to be confirmed on the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program at the time of the purchase or acquisition, so as of the closing date. And the property must be their principal residence. So it can't be someone that would qualify under the nominee exemption, but they're not buying this property as a principal resident, they're buying it as an investment property. If it's an investment property, it doesn't matter that they could qualify as a nominee exemption. It's not their principal residence, so the NRST would still be payable. Similarly, there's the refugee exemption for a foreign national that's been given status as a convention refugee or a person in need of protection under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act at the time of closing. So if they qualify for that as a refugee, they would be exempt from the NRST. And then the third one is the spousal exemption, and the definition of spouse is the one used in the Land Transfer Tax Act. So it's a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, or if you qualify as a nominee or refugee, you'll be exempt if you're buying it jointly with that spouse. So here's an example of how this applies. If 3 people are buying a property, one's a Canadian citizen buying with their foreign national spouse, and the third party is a foreign national, the exemption would not apply and the NRST would be payable because the third party, who's a foreign national, taints it for everybody else. So if it was just the Canadian citizen and their foreign national spouse who qualified for the exemption buying it alone, there's no NRST because the spousal exemption applies. If anybody else is acquiring an interest that is a foreign national, then the spousal exemption doesn't matter because the whole transaction is subject to the NRST. Now, rebates. Here's Sabiha's question. There were 3 rebates built into the original legislation, and this is important because you'll see in a couple minutes the amendment is going to take away some of this, the recently passed amendment. So the 3 rebates that are available is, and again here, if to qualify at the time of closing, you're paying the NRST, you're paying the 15%, okay? After closing, if your facts fall into one of these 3 categories, you might qualify to get the money back and get a rebate. So after closing, if a person becomes a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident within 4 years of the closing date, okay, if they become either of those within 4 years of the closing date, they can get the rebate back. If they become a Canadian citizen or permanent resident 5 years after the closing date, they will not get it back. It's got to be within 4 years of the closing date. Okay. The second rebate is available to a student. So to qualify as a student, you have to be enrolled full-time for at least 2 years from the closing date in an improved institution. Okay. And the government publishes exactly what's considered an approved institution. And it's most colleges and universities. The only thing they're excluding is some private institutions that they haven't approved. But if it's a qualified approved institution and there's a list that gets published, students enrolled there, they have to be there for at least 2 years after. If they're in for a year before the closing and 1 year after the closing, they won't get this. It has to be 2 years after the closing that they're enrolled in an approved institution, then they can apply to get the rebate back. The third rebate is available for someone who is working full-time in Ontario for a continuous period of 1 year after the closing date, okay? And they have to be legally working full-time in Ontario. So they would have to be under a proper permit to be working full-time in Ontario for a period of 1 year after the closing date. Again, if they're working for 1 year, but 2 months were prior to the closing date and 10 months were after the closing date, they wouldn't qualify. Okay, the government has a strict interpretation of these rebate rules. Okay, so legally working in Ontario, continuous period, 1 year after the closing. You've got to fit each one of those categories to qualify for the rebate.
So David, they would apply for the rebate after the 12-month period?
Exactly. For all these rebates, you can't apply until after the time period goes by.
Right.
Okay. And it depends on your facts. So, and people have certain intentions at the time of closing. Some people, their fact situations change, but it's whatever the facts ends up being when that time period is up. That's the time you look and you try and do the application. I'm involved in an application right now for a player on the Leafs, and a big win last night. Go Leafs, go! Who signed here, under a 3-year contract to play for the Leafs. He's considered a foreign entity, be subject to Nrst. Didn't use my firm or consult with my firm. Bought a property right after he was signed. The lawyer didn't tell him about the Nrst until the day before closing and said, "Oh, by the way, you've got to pay $500,000 in Nrst tomorrow."
Wow. So
he scrambled and paid it because he had to protect his transaction, and he was able to do it. And then someone referred him to me to say, like, what do we do now? Like, is there a way to get this back? So we haven't submitted anything yet because he has to finish his time period. He's got to finish working here for at least a year before we can apply. And it gets tricky with someone like him because he was really concerned that he was going to be traded during the season. And there was a lot of speculation that he was going to be traded in March at the trading deadline. And then maybe fortunately for him, he got hurt and was not eligible to be traded anymore, because if he was traded and he was no longer here, he would not qualify. So right now, if he doesn't get traded before his year is up, he might still be able to get this, and he's under a valid work permit to work here, but he's got to get through that 1 year period. We also looked at, okay, what if you don't qualify? Would he get traded? Would he fit under another rebate? Would he be interested in becoming a permanent resident or citizen of Canada? And he was looking at that as a possibility. But the other thing with these rebates is, you see here, in order to be eligible for these rebates, you have to exclusively hold this property, or by yourself or with your spouse if you have a spouse, and it has to be used as your principal residence for that whole time period. So that created another issue for this player, because as soon as the playoffs are over, he's usually gone to his home country, and he's not always living here. So he said, look, if you're going to do this, you've got to establish this as your principal residence. You can't have a principal residence in another country, and you can't just disappear for 4 months because the government's going to look at that. So you've got to have a plan. If you're going to try and qualify for one of these rebates, the facts have to fit or you won't get it. So, but that's a key thing. In order to qualify, you have to be using that principal residence as your principal residence for the duration of the period. Whether it's the student period, or whether it's the workers period, or whether it's the 4-year period that you have to qualify to become a permanent resident or citizen of Canada. That has to be your principal residence. Okay, which is another principal residence. Yep.
David, so let's say when you say it's legally working, so let's say if somebody opens an incorporation for a year and they work through that incorporation, is that legally working here, or it won't be considered?
They have to be on a valid work permit.
Okay. So let's say if they open an incorporation, that won't count.
That wouldn't do it. That wouldn't be enough.
Okay.
Okay, that's too easy a loophole to try and close, and they won't accept that. They want to, and the government looks at everything when they look to see whether you qualify for these things, because in the case of a rebate, they have your money and they're reluctant to give it back. So they look at everything. So they want to see. They look through all your records. They have access to a lot of things, and they want to see this is the only property you own. It's the only principal residence. All your mail goes there. All your utility bills are there. Who's living there? They look to see if you own other property. Are you leasing something? They look into all that. They look at your records of flying in and out of the country and where you are, and they'll question you, and they look at everything. So it has to, your facts have to fit. Okay.
Great, yeah. David, I have a quick question. So I understand the latter two, but the first one, which is the resident or the citizen within the 4-year period, right?
Yep.
So that can happen at any time. So your property closes, or you bought a pre-construction, your property closes, you come here, you've got the status of the permanent resident. So then you can apply for the rebate right away,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you become a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident at any time after the closing, you can apply as soon as you
Right.
become that. You
Yeah.
don't have to wait the 4 years.
Yeah, and
Okay.
you may or may not be staying here for that 189 that you stay for the 189 days, but you still get the rebate right off the bat.
Well,
Yeah.
it's not a question of where you're living. Like you're thinking of non-resident status, like when you sell a
Right.
property and you're spending more days out of the country than you are in the country, and you've sold a property.
This is not that.
That's not the test here. It's whether
Right.
this is your principal residence. Is this your home? Is this where you're actually living? So in the case of if you're applying because you become a PR or you become a Canadian citizen after the closing and you apply for this, as long as this was your principal residence up to the point that you applied,
You're okay.
and now you've got it, you got the money back. After you get the money back and you're already a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, it doesn't matter if you continue to use this as your principal residence. Okay.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So, and the good news is if you qualify for a rebate, you get the full 15% back and you get it with interest. There's a prescribed rate, rates are low, but you do get it back with interest. So you do get the full thing back. Now it is quite a process, and the government, like I said before, they can look at all kinds of things. There's, it's an application process. They ask for all kinds of supporting documentation to support these applications. And at the end of the day, the facts fit or they don't fit. Okay. You're either qualify or you're not going to qualify. Okay. So all that we just covered so far still applies without amendment, without any changes. Everything that we just covered still applies to any transaction where the agreement of purchase and sale was signed March 29th of this year or earlier, because the amendment came in on March 29th this year. Okay. So anything that predated this amendment is grandfathered and the old rules still apply. Okay. So we're coming up to closings on a bunch of transactions, but it's a question. It's not the closing date that's important. It's the date the agreement of purchase and sale was signed. So the agreement of purchase and sale was signed prior to March 30th. Then the old rule that I just went through, Nrst, applies. Okay. The rebate rules apply. The exemption rules apply. It's still 15%. Nothing changes. Okay. But the amendment came in March 29th. So it's effective March 30th. So as of March 30th, there's three major changes that came into the legislation. The Nrst goes up from 15% to 20%. Like, why not? The government was doing nothing. They were getting 15% of all the action. Now they're going to get 20% of all the action. And again, their theory is, well, this is going to stop foreigners from buying property or slow them down a little bit. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I can tell you the same people that were going to pay 15% before because it was still a good investment will bite the bullet and probably still pay 20%. Some won't, but a lot will. But even if they all did, it's still like 5-6% of the overall market. So you're just pulling that, those number of people out, and you still have everybody else that's competing to buy properties with this very low inventory that's out there right now. So we'll see. But the good news for the government is they get an extra 5% of the action right now. And the second change is the Nrst now applies province-wide. So there's no more greater Golden Horseshoe region that this is applicable to. If you buy a residential property anywhere in the province of Ontario, sign an agreement March 30th or later, and you're a foreign entity, the Nrst is going to be payable. So the greater Golden Horseshoe region still applies for any agreement signed March 29th or earlier. Afterwards, this is applicable to the whole province. So now you can't just decide, okay, I'm going to go buy a Muskoka instead of Aurelia to get out of the greater Golden Horseshoe, because if you're buying a Muskoka and you're a foreign entity, you're going to pay 20% of the purchase price. Okay. And the third change that was announced was they eliminated two of the rebates. So the rebate for the students and the rebate for the foreign nationals working legally in Ontario are now eliminated going forward. Okay, so even if you are a student enrolled in a program 2 years after closing, you can't apply if your agreement of purchase and sale was signed March 30th or later. Same thing with the work permit. Now, the rebates are not eliminated for any agreement of purchase and sale that was signed March 29th or earlier. They still apply. And that's why I wanted to go over them with you. So we're coming up on closings for those transactions. And if we close on that, they pay their 15%, and still 15% because it was prior to March 30th. They pay their 15%. If someone enrolls and then later qualifies under the student exemption, or they're a worker, somebody else that gets traded to the Leafs, or anybody else, if they're under a valid permit and they later qualify, those rules still apply as long as the agreement of purchase and sale was prior to March 30th. Okay, anything signed after March 30th, those rebates are not applicable. Okay, the third rate rebate wasn't touched at all. So there are some transitional rules that were put in for the increase, and I think I've probably mentioned them already. So this applies, the increase applies to any agreement of purchase and sale or an assignment. It applies to assignments of agreement of purchase and sale as well. So that's really important for you to note. If it was signed on or before March 29th, it's not subject to the 20%. It's still a 15% if it's and then on the final closing, if the land is conveyed to any foreign entity or taxable trustee that didn't sign the agreement or an assignment of agreement, the increase applies. Okay, so important to see the difference, important to note the difference. I know some of you are already involved in these type of transactions. We're figuring it out. We have to look at each one on a case-by-case basis. We've got to look at spousal exemptions and things like that. Look when the dates are happened. And we're talking, the people are trying to assign agreement purchase. There's a lot of that going on, as you probably are aware, in the market. There's a lot of assignments out there right now because people are coming up to closings, and some can't close on their own. And they've got, you probably had some discussion when you were talking about the increase in mortgage rates. Some people that legitimately bought properties for themselves 3, 4, 5 years ago. Now it's coming time to close, and they can't afford the mortgage that they qualified for a couple of years ago because the rates are higher. And some people are out there looking to assign their agreement in order to protect their deposit and try and get their money out, and maybe and protect the equity because the property's values have gone up. So there's a lot of assignment transactions out there, but you have to know that assignment transactions are subject to the Nrst as well. Okay, so the way you got to look at this is you pay Nrst on closing, and if the person closing is not the same person that signed the original agreement of purchase and sale, they don't get the 15% rate. It'd be a 20% rate if there's an attempt to assign it, or even by direction retitle to assign it, or direct title to somebody else. Okay, so the issue is always, what's the date the agreement was signed? That's the thing that directs it originally. And if it was signed after that date, even if it was an assignment, it's the higher rate that would apply. There's also some transitional provisions that were announced with respect to the territory, because again, like I mentioned before, Nrst, whether it's the agreement of purchase sale or an assignment, if it was prior to March 29th, outside of the Greater Golden Horseshoe, it's not payable at 15% or 20%. Okay, so if a property is in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, if the agreement or the assignment of the agreement was signed on or before March 29th, there's no change, 15%. If the agreement or an assignment of the agreement purchase sale is signed on or after March 30th, the 20% rate applies. Okay, so it's really not that complicated. It's just a question of looking at at the dates and the timing. And we just put an example in here. So you have a foreign entity buyer that signed an agreement for a property in Timmins, Ontario, signed on March 29th. The buyer wouldn't have to pay Nrst because Timmins is outside the greater Golden Horseshoe. If that same buyer signed an agreement to buy a property in Timmins on March 30th, the Nrst would be payable because it doesn't matter if it's outside the greater Golden Horseshoe. And then because it's payable on this property, it would be payable at the 20% rate and not the 15% rate. So the transitional provisions for the student and worker rebates. So those are the rebates that are now eliminated going forward, but students and workers still qualify for those rebates. If, you know, this, again, they would have paid the Nrst at the time of closing, but if their agreement or the assignment agreement was signed on or before March 29th, and they still meet all the other eligibility criteria, they could apply to get those rebates. Okay, anything signed March 30th or later, no more student rebate, no more worker rebate, doesn't matter if you would otherwise qualify, otherwise be eligible. That was eliminated. Okay, so those are the amendments.
David, just a quick question. So if a foreign buyer buys a property with a new construction or new development with a builder, and he doesn't close, and he sells it on assignment, how does the Nrst apply then?
Yeah, the Nrst would still be payable.
And Nrst is for purchase, someone.
But he won't close. So he won't close this. He will just assign it to someone else.
It's still payable because they've closed that loophole. They want to get these on assignments. They don't want, otherwise everybody that would be subject to this tax would be trying to assign it to somebody else. So the government says, we don't care if the original agreement was signed prior to the date. We don't care when you assign it. We're still going to collect the Nrst. So
they'll collect it at the time they are assigning the
no,
contract?
On closing. It's payable on closing. You can't close a transaction. The way they did this, and when they set up the original Nrst, is before they'll allow you to register a transfer on any transaction in the province of Ontario, you have to submit forms to the government that basically goes through whether the Nrst is going to be payable or not payable. So even though the Nrst is payable on 4 to 6% of the transactions for the last 5 years, on 100% of the transactions, we have to go through a process to submit to the province of Ontario these forms that have to be completed that determine whether or not the Nrst is payable. And until the government is satisfied with that, they won't allow you to register a transfer. Okay, so back 5 years ago, they imposed all this extra work on us poor lawyers to go through this process each time and basically use us to try and collect this 15% for them because they won't allow us to close a transaction. So either we have to collect the 15% and pay it to the government on the closing, or they won't allow us to close, or we have to satisfy the government before they allow us to register the transfer that the 15% isn't payable. And we have to do that on all closings, whether or not it was in the Golden Horseshoe or not in the Golden Horseshoe, because part of the application process was to say, hey, this property is not in the greater Golden Horseshoe, therefore it's not payable. But we have to go through this on every single closing. You know, it's extra work they imposed on us as lawyers on transactions. Lawyers aren't getting an extra percentage. The government didn't cut us in. The government said, we're getting 15%. Lawyers, you got to do extra work. Things are competitive out there. You're probably not even be able to charge your clients for doing this extra work, but we want you to do this anyways. Please collect the 15% for us. And we're such nice people that we do it.
Complied.
Right.
Yeah, we have no choice but to comply. So the other thing, just, you know, last sort of point I really want to make on this is they did put an outside date on this. If you're submitting for a rebate application for under the student or the workers rebate, the rebate application has to be submitted before March 31, 2025, or within 4 years of the that the NRST became payable, which is the closing date. So they did, try and put outside limits on this. So that's the other thing we have to be careful for if someone is going to be able to apply for one of those rebates. We got to make sure we do it within those time periods. So that's not the end of our discussion. That's just sort of the end of this part of the discussion. I could actually stop sharing my screen, but the other parts to be, I think that we wanted to talk about a little bit is what the federal government is now proposing to do, right?
The
Sabiha?
ban, yeah. Yes, that's right, the ban. Do you think they're going to go forward with that, or?
Well, again, you don't know for sure, okay? This came out in a budget, and sometimes, the government of the day, just throws certain things out there and waits to see how much complaining goes on before they actually go ahead with something. So, who knows? Until we actually see it in legislation and see what it looks like, you never know. Are they going to back off on it? Are they going to go ahead with it? This is the federal government. And for those of you, just to make sure everybody's following the same conversation, what we've looked at, Nrst is the provincial government, okay? This is what the provincial government is saying. The provincial government just announced March 29th, we're changing the Nrst rules. We want to go to 20%. We want to be a whole province of Ontario. That's how we're going to address some of this market condition, okay? Then the federal government says, we don't care what you're doing, provinces. We're getting a lot of pressure also to do something about the market. And really the markets that are really affected in Canada, if you think about it, it's mostly Vancouver and Toronto.
Yeah.
Okay. But federal government says, okay, we're going to pass, we're thinking of passing legislation throughout Canada to put a ban on foreign buyers for 2 years, because that's going to slow down the market and get the prices under control. So again, I hate providing political commentary, but I can't help myself. And just by me criticizing the current federal government doesn't mean that I'm a supporter of anybody in opposition, because they're not coming up with better stuff either. But like, does someone in Saskatoon really care about this? Or in some other small town in somewhere else in Ontario? Like, are they being driven by, the price is being driven by foreign buyers? Why would they tax a foreign buyer that wants to immigrate to Canada and wants to go and go work in a place that really needs people to go and work in some small town in Ontario or in Manitoba? To me, it doesn't make any sense when they're really trying to address what's going on in Vancouver and Toronto.
Right. My concern now is that if they have brought in that there will be no rebates for students at all past March 31st. I know that a lot of people were sending their kids to university also with the added interest of, instead of renting or having a dorm for 5 years, or I don't know, my kids seem to be wanting to stay in school for the next age. But, it's expensive.
Yeah.
It's expensive for a parent. My son did 4 years, and now he's going for a 2-year master's, and then he wants to go to law school. It's like, I'm looking at renting in these expensive places and student rental is not cheap by any means.
Yeah, and look, like there's a lot of examples of these are legitimate plans, okay? People from another country who are just, foreign entities, they're foreign nationals, but they want their kids to go to school here. So we've acted for a number of transactions like that over many years, where people are, buying a condo here because they want their kids to go to university here. Sometimes they buy it, they might rent it out for a period of time till the kids get old enough, then the kids come to university. Sometimes, the kids are already going to university somewhere here, and they buy a place. They want the kids, to live. Like, these are legitimate things. So if they sign that agreement of purchase and sale prior to the amendment, they can still do that. Like, nothing is stopping that. But for anybody that's thinking of doing it now, that's not going to work. Okay, they're not going to. First of all, they're going to pay 20% instead of the 15%. And then regardless of how long their kids go to school here, they're not going to be eligible for a rebate unless the government backs off on this at some point in the future, or the government gets defeated and the next government comes in and they say, hey, forget about those amendments, we're going back to the old rules, or they pass something else. But
Yeah,
until
or
the
the
law
kid
changes
applies
again,
for
they're
permanent
not going to get it.
residence.
Sorry?
Yeah. Or the kid applies for permanent residence, which a lot of
Yes.
students are doing here, right?
Right. So if they, yeah, so if they can qualify that way, you know, they can get it back. And again, it's just going to be a question of fact. So bottom line is, closing comes, they got to pay the Nrst, and then it's a question of facts. Will they qualify down afterwards because they became a Canadian citizen, they became a permanent resident, or if the agreement predated the March 2022 amendment, then they can still apply under the student or the worker rebate if applicable. Okay. So anyways, back to the federal government thing. You know, the federal government is saying, we're just going to stop any foreign buyer from buying any property for a 2-year period and see what that does. Now, we have a minority government there right now in place. So first test is, you know, is the NDP going to support this or not? And I don't think that's been clearly announced either, because if the NDP says, no, you know, we're not, it was in the budget, but we're not prepared to do that, then it's never going to become law. Because if it's put to a vote and the NDP votes against it, they essentially vote out the government and there's another election. So I don't think anybody really wants an election yet, because I don't think any of the parties are quite ready for another election. I think they're happy to leave it in a minority situation for a while. Conservatives in the process of getting a new leader. They're not pushing for an election yet. NDP has some power just because they're propping up the government right now, so they're not in a hurry. But all it takes is, you know, the NDP to say to Trudeau, you know, you passed a bunch of the budget, you got a bunch to propose, but it's something we don't like, so don't go ahead with it. And this could be one of them, like, who knows? So until it becomes legislation, you know, I look at it, it's smoke and mirrors. So, you know, what are you going to tell your foreign buyers? You're going to tell them, like, be careful. If you buy something right now, since the budget was mentioned in the budget as of that date. So if they buy something after the budget, when law is passed, there's usually a grandfathering period, but it usually applies only to things prior to a certain date. And that date might be the budget date as opposed to the date that the law is actually passed, because they told everybody.
Couldn't put a ban on something that is already purchased, right? So
No.
I mean, so I think what you would tell your clients would be, let's do it fairly quickly in case.
Well, no,
you
but
know.
even if they're buying it anytime after the budget, you know, this was announced in the budget, when they actually passed the legislation, the effective date might be the date of the budget, the date of the announcement. So it might be applicable to anything, because they already give everybody a warning. They're saying, hey, here's what we're proposing to do. So if you bought something prior to that budget announcement, it wouldn't apply. A foreign national wouldn't be banned from doing it. But if you bought it after that budget date, then it's fair game for them to say, no, we told you in our budget announcement that we were going to pass this. So anything from that date forward is banned.
Really? So David, so if the budget is it's not yet approved or accepted, right? So what happens if I've bought, being a foreign investor, I buy a property today, I'm not able to close it then? If it's closing in, say,
Yeah.
a year?
Yeah, you probably have to
Wow.
find, you're either going to default on your agreement of purchase and sale because you can't close, or the government might announce, depends what the government wants to do. The government might say that anything that was signed after the budget date and before the legislation is null and void. I don't know if they're going to do that. They might say, no, we gave you fair warning. If you signed an agreement after the budget date, you're not allowed to close on it because you're not allowed to buy property. So you're going to either default under that agreement, or we'll allow you to assign that agreement of purchase and sale to a Canadian, to someone that's not subject to the ban.
That could create a lot of confusion, especially if the builder is not allowing an assignment. That could
that's going to create problems.
Mess.
Yeah, and then it creates other issues. Okay, let's say you are assigning it. What if you're making a profit on the assignment? Like, there's no way the government's going to allow anybody to profit on an assignment, on a transaction that's banned. So, it's right now, I think we're in a buyer beware situation. You got to be telling your foreign buyer clients there's uncertainty here. If you buy anything right now, until we know exactly what the transitional rules are and the effective dates are, you're really doing so at your own risk and peril. So you got to be really careful, because we don't know if you're going to be able, you may not be able to close, and you may not be able to even assign it. Or if you do assign it, you might be able to, they might allow you to assign it, but you're not going to be able, they're not going to let you walk out of the country with any profit on an assignment. So what's the advantage of entering into it if they're going to, you're going to give a deposit and you hope you get your deposit back, and any profit is not going to go to you in any event. So we don't know, and I hate doing any seminar or webinar when I'm just telling you there's uncertainty in the market, but we know what the rules are with the Nrst and the amendment. Okay, they passed it, they've published these transitional provisions so we can follow it. And there's still some transitional provisions that might come up, but the federal government so far, we don't know anything. This was like, it's pie in the sky. They threw it out there, but they did say it, so we have to take it seriously. But they haven't elaborated on exactly how this will work or what this means.
Right. Karen Vitier is asking, if your client buys an assignment and it closes, what happens if the lawyer doesn't catch that the original purchaser should have paid the 20%? Is there a clause that we should be using when purchasing an assignment?
Great question, Karen. And yeah, first of all, assignments, for those of you that have done them, know how difficult they are, because there's so many issues that we have to deal with. And this is just throwing another wrench in it. And we're just starting to figure out what we got to put in these agreements to deal with this, or how we have to tweak some clauses that we were doing previously. So, not to be evasive, but I'd like to look at every assignment transaction on its own, because there's so many issues that come up, and tax issues, and tune into David and David podcasts. We just did 2 episodes on assignments because we couldn't possibly finish in 1 episode. We probably need 4 more parts to completely finish it. But there's so many issues on assignment, tax related issues, HST issues, HST rebate issues. And then even before we get to these, to these new issues that are coming up, there's land transfer tax issues, there's income tax issues, there's capital gains tax issues on these, and they're really difficult. So yeah, Karen, like there will be some tweaking of some clauses that because we have to address these issues and look at exactly what the fact situation we're dealing with. Okay, was it someone subject to Nrst, and which Nrst, the old law, the new law, and now they're assigning to somebody else? What are the dates of the original agreement? What's the date of the assignment agreement? What's the status of the original buyer? What's the status of the new buyer? And does anybody taint this? Does this property become subject to Nrst? And then how do we make sure we got the right clauses in the assignment agreement of purchase and sale? And no easy task. Okay, and as soon as we think we've got some of this figured out, the government passes something like this. So we got to look at assignments going forward and fit the fact situation, and then tweak our clauses. So the best advice I can give to you, Karen, or anybody else doing an assignment, if you can get 1 clause in your agreement, it's that it's conditional on lawyer review, because we need some time to look at it and understand the facts, and then figure out what clauses really have to go in there to protect either the assignor or the assignee. How's that for an evasive answer?
That's amazing. Abu has 2 questions. If someone who is on a work permit purchases the property, continuously working for more than a year, but has purchased the property along with his wife on the title, but the wife is not working, but just moved as a dependent with this family, would they still be eligible for the rebate? So, well, I think that was answered already, that the permanent resident does get
there's a spousal exemption available, as long as nobody else that's involved in the transaction taints it, then I think what they're sort of setting out there is that there'd be a spousal exemption available.
Yeah. So whether the wife is living here or is not not permanently living here,
No,
as
no.
long as one
One of
spouse
them,
is, that's good enough. Yeah.
yeah, one of them has to be like the buyer or the spouse has to be using it as their principal residence.
Right. Right.
No, I'm not talking about exactly permanent resident. We know that nowadays the permanent residentship for the international folks who are working here is not going that quickly as compared to earlier because of, I think, lots of refugee intakes that's going on, be it for Afghanistan or Ukraine. The PR processing is not as fast as it used to be earlier for the foreign nationals who are working on here on work permit. So I have an interesting case where these people that bought the house when they were on work permit under the old rule of Nrst, continuously lived there for more than a year as a primary residence and still living there as a that place as primary residence. However, the work permit is expiring and they cannot any longer renew the work permit. They have to go back to their home country. And now they have already paid Nrst, and now there is like what would be the way they could get back the Nrst if they have to sell the home before moving to their home country. That's what I was talking from that perspective.
Well, it's hard for me to give you a definitive answer without seeing each and every fact situation like right through the process. But in general terms, if they paid the Nrst, they worked under a work permit, the year is up, they can apply at that time. They submit everything, and if they qualify, if they meet all the eligibility criteria, they'll get the rebate back because they were still here. So now, there's a time lag. You apply, you don't get it the next day. Sometimes it takes the government a couple months to go through it. But what the government is looking at is everything that happened up until the application date. Because if they qualify because they were working for that year and they meet all the other eligibility criteria, then they apply. It doesn't matter what they do after the application date, because everything that's looked at is up to the application date, whether they either qualify or they don't qualify. So, and if they qualify, they'll get the money back. And it doesn't matter by the time they get by the time they get the check, they're already not living here. It doesn't really matter. The facts were that they were here for a full year. If that was the real fact under a valid working permit and they qualify, then they'll qualify. They'll get it back. Okay.
So here in this case, like if one spouse is on work permit and the other one is the dependent, not on any kind of work permit, but the title has been on both of their name. That's where the dilemma begins. Like because the other person is still a foreign national, not on work permit. The first person is on work permit, working continuously for it.
Oh, so the question is, one person is on a valid work permit, but they own the property together, and the spouse is not.
Yes, that's the thing. The spouse is not on work permit. It's
And
just
not case, yeah. Would they still qualify? That's a good question. Valid work permit, and they both own the property. Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna have to check on that. If you send me an email, I'll check on that and get back to you on it, because I'm not sure. I think they would still qualify because one is on a valid work permit. Okay, if you send me an email, I'll look into that and get back to you on that.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks a lot, Dan.
All right. Are there any more questions? I think it was an amazing session, David, as usual. I learned so much, and I'm sure everybody else. We have a great full house here. and I'll share the recording with everybody so that you can have it on file to go back to it. But yeah, Corman's LLP are around for us always, and go ahead and use them for your clients or your own properties, and you will have this caliber of understanding the law and whatever's happening. And what's really great is that you should be prepared for what may come. It's not when you're in the pool and it's you've already been faced with the problem. It's great to be on top of it from beforehand. So thank you so much, David, for this session. It was amazing.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to the opportunity to see more people in person in the coming months. And maybe we'll get back to doing these, live as seminars instead of webinars. But always great to be with the Sutton Summit Group, a valued partner with our firm, and so many familiar faces and everything. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.